2:17 in the morning, and the dogs knew first. That was always how it happened. Not the sensors, not the overwatch camera on the ridgeline, not the motion detectors strung along the eastern wall like Christmas lights on a dead tree. The dogs knew first, and if you understood anything about working at COP Harrow, you understood that when the dogs got quiet, you stopped breathing and you listened. Sergeant First Class Sarah Kowalski was awake before the attack began. She had been awake for 11 minutes, lying on her cot in the small kennel annex with her boots already laced because Rex had stopped his low sleep panting at 2:06 and had not made a sound since. That silence was a language she had been reading for 6 years. A Belgian Malinois named Rex, with a torn left ear and a white scar across his muzzle, could communicate more in 11 minutes of total stillness than most people communicated in a lifetime of words. She was at the kennel door when the first rocket hit. The impact came from the north face, about 40 meters past the motor pool, and the concussion rolled through the compound like a stone dropped into still water. Then the second hit. Closer. She felt the pressure wave through the soles of her boots. Rex was up and against the wire of his run, not barking, just watching her with those amber eyes that caught whatever thin light existed in the world. She released him. That was protocol. That was not protocol. That was both things at once, and she decided it in under a second, because the third rocket came in and it took out the generator housing on the west side, and COP Harrow went dark except for the fire. She moved through the dark with Rex at her left heel, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his flank. Her M4A1 was up. The night vision monocular was already mounted. She'd slept in her kit for 3 nights running, because the pattern of activity outside the wire had been wrong in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who would listen. Specialist Aaron Fuentes had been on tower watch. She found him at the base of the northwest tower with his hand pressed against his neck, sitting down hard in the gravel, making a sound that wasn't quite words. She got to him in 6 seconds. The entry wound was lateral, high. She had the tourniquet on his arm before she registered that wasn't where he was bleeding from. She adjusted. Her hands found the source. She packed it with hemostatic gauze from her IFAK and pressed her palm flat against the wound and told him with her eyes to stay there, stay right there, because she needed both hands for what was about to happen. She was aware, in a removed way, that 3 other soldiers had come around the corner of the motor pool and stopped moving when they saw her. Specialist Maria Ochoa was one of them. Corporal James Whitfield, a young private whose name she hadn't learned yet. They had stopped because they didn't know what to do, and she was doing something with a certainty that didn't match what they understood about her. They didn't know who she was. They had known her for 4 months, and they still did not know. And right now that didn't matter, because the eastern gate was compromised, and there were at minimum 6 fighters inside the wire. She stood up. Rex was already moving. She told Ochoa to apply direct pressure and not move until medevac was established. She told Whitfield to get his weapon up and stay on her left. She told the private to get to the command post and tell whoever was there that the eastern gate was the breach point, not the north face. The north face was a diversion. Then she moved toward the gate, and the soldiers who had stopped moving started moving again, because there are people in the world who carry authority in their bodies the way other people carry tension. And when Sergeant First Class Sarah Kowalski moved, something in the air said, "Follow." They didn't know that yet. They were about to. 8 months earlier, Sarah had been living in a 2-room apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled permanently of the previous tenant's cigarettes and the coffee shop 2 floors below. The apartment was nearly empty. A cot, a footlocker, a folding table with a coffee maker on it, and nothing else. She had been there 6 months and had not unpacked the second box, the one with the books and the kitchen things, because the second box felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. She was from a small town called Ridgefield, outside of Medford in southern Oregon, a place with a grain elevator visible from every street and a high school that graduated 94 students in her year. Her father had worked maintenance for the county road department for 31 years. Her mother taught 3rd grade and still did. Sarah had grown up in a house where dinner was at 6 and expectations were quiet but serious, where her father watched the news with his hands folded and her mother read paperbacks in every spare minute, where the conversation at the table was never about big things, but always left her feeling that big things were possible. She had joined the army at 19 because the army was the fastest way out and the fastest way towards something she couldn't name but recognized the shape of. She had been a good student and a better athlete, long and quick with the kind of endurance that came from spending summers running logging roads. But what she had most was a quality that her high school cross-country coach had once called comfortable with discomfort. She didn't know what to do with that at 19. The army did. She had gone in as military police because that was what the recruiter suggested, and she didn't know enough to push back. And she had discovered within 6 months that she was good at it in the way that some people are good at languages, naturally and without apparent effort. She had an instinct for reading situations before they developed. She made decisions quickly and revised them without ego. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, it was usually the thing that needed saying. She volunteered for military working dog handler school at Fort Leonard Wood in her 3rd year, after a deployment to Bagram that had taught her what she wanted her career to look like. The dog school was 8 weeks of the most complete and satisfying training she had ever experienced. She had been paired with a 2-year-old Malinois named Baron, worked detection and patrol, and understood within the first week that this was the thing. The dog and handler relationship required everything she had and gave back something she couldn't quantify. She completed that first deployment and came back and immediately applied for Ranger School. That was a thing most people didn't know about her, and the thing she didn't talk about, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it changed how people treated her, and she preferred to be treated like what she was, which was a dog handler who was good at her job. But the record existed. Fort Benning, Georgia. Ranger Class 09-14. She had been one of 8 women in the integrated assessment cycle, and she had been one of 3 who completed all 3 phases, Benning, Mountain, and Florida, without recycling. She had earned the Ranger tab at 27 years old and worn it under her sleeve for the remaining time on active duty, because wearing it openly changed the conversation in ways that made her job harder. She had done 4 deployments total, 2 as a military police dog handler, one with a special operations support element in Kunar Province running route clearance, one as a contractor-attached K9 handler with a joint task force in Djibouti that she did not discuss specifically, and did not have to discuss, because the paperwork on that one had been brief on details in ways that were intentional. She had left active duty at 29, not because she was done, but because the Army's plan for her and her plan for herself had reached an impasse that nobody was interested in resolving. She had spent a year doing private security contract work in Baghdad, and then a year trying Fayetteville and the two-room apartment and the unpacked box, and then a former supervisor had reached out about a contract K9 handler position attached to a support battalion deploying to Kunar Province in eastern Afghanistan, and she had taken it without much deliberation because the alternative was another year staring at the coffee maker on the folding table. She had arrived at COP Harrow in late February, a contractor in an army unit, handler of a Malinois named Rex with a torn left ear and a white scar on his muzzle, introduced as a dog handler and understood as just that. She was 31 years old. She had sandy brown hair cut short enough to stay out of her eyes, a narrow face with a jaw that suggested stubbornness before she opened her mouth, hands with a scar across the left palm from a training incident at Benning that she wore without comment. She weighed 143 pounds and could run a 5-mile in just under 31 minutes after 11 hours of patrol rotation. The bronze coin lived in her right cargo pocket. It was the size of a silver dollar, heavier than it looked, cast with the Ranger scroll on one face and the Ranger Regiment crest on the other. She had been given it at the end of Florida phase by a retired sergeant major who came to graduations because he had no grandchildren and thought this was a better use of a Friday. He had pressed it into her hand and said something quiet she had never repeated to anyone. She had carried it for 4 years. It had been in her pocket in Nangarhar. It had been in her pocket in Djibouti. It was in her pocket now, and she reached for it sometimes in the way that other people might touch a cross or press a thumb against a scar. Not for luck, but for a specific quality of memory that reminded her who she actually was. COP Harrow sat in a narrow valley in Kunar Province with a ridgeline to the east that went to roughly 2,300 meters and a riverbed to the west that ran dry 6 months of the year and flooded viciously for the other 6. The compound had been built in 2011 by an engineer battalion and had been continuously occupied since. A small installation of HESCO barriers and prefab structures, and a motor pool that always smelled of diesel and hydraulic fluid. There were 74 soldiers assigned there, plus 4 contracted personnel, including Sarah, plus 2 military working dogs, including Rex, and a yellow Labrador named Birch, who belonged to another handler named Sergeant First Class David Kang. Sarah's job was patrol augmentation and route detection. She ran Rex on sweeps ahead of vehicle convoys, worked perimeter checks twice daily, and on 3 occasions had assisted in detainee handling situations where Rex's presence had an effect that no rifle could replicate. She was thorough and quiet and professional. She did not ask for things. She maintained her own equipment. She kept her area of the kennel annex cleaner than the rest of the compound combined. The battalion's soldiers called her Handler, or just K9. A few called her Sergeant, in the way you'd address anyone with prior service, not knowing her actual rank history, which was more complicated than a simple grade. Sergeant First Class Aaron Nguyen, the Charlie Company First Sergeant, had assessed her in the first week as competent, organized, and unlikely to cause problems, which was his highest available category of approval. The only person at COP Harrow who had any suspicion about Sarah's background was Staff Sergeant Maria Ochoa, who ran the S2 shop's analytical function at the company level and was sharp in ways that went sideways from her official duties. Ochoa had once watched Sarah direct Rex through a complex search pattern on a mock IED lane and had said afterward, quietly, that she moved through space differently from other dog handlers Ochoa had worked with. Sarah had deflected the observation. Ochoa had filed it away. She had a reason for keeping her background quiet that was not false modesty. She had learned on her second deployment that when people know you have a particular set of skills, they assign you tasks based on their understanding of those skills, rather than on your actual judgment about what tasks are appropriate. She had spent 3 months in Nangarhar, being asked to do things that were outside her actual expertise, because someone had read a line in her file and made an assumption. She had done those things because she was good at adapting, but 2 of them had gone badly in ways that a different assignment would have avoided. She preferred to be used correctly. She preferred to be underestimated until the moment when underestimation became dangerous for people around her. That moment came at COP Harrow on a Tuesday night in October, which was cold even at low elevation, with stars that looked as though they had been thrown against the sky with some violence. The intelligence picture had been building for 2 weeks before the attack. Ochoa had been flagging it in her daily products. There had been 3 separate reports of fighter movement in the eastern ridgeline area, all from different sources, all in the 10-kilometer radius around COP Harrow. There had been an increase in civilian traffic departures from the nearest village, Pashdar Calais, roughly 1.4 kilometers southeast, which was a pattern that historically preceded hostile activity in the region. There had been a signals intercept that the battalion S2 had assessed as low confidence, but Sarah had read herself. In the shared intel folder she technically wasn't supposed to have access to, but did because Ochoa trusted her eyes, and the phrasing in the translated intercept felt to her like finality, like a plan that had been made and was now being set into motion. She had mentioned it to Sergeant First Class Nguyen on the Saturday before the attack. She had described what she was reading in the pattern without revealing how she was reading it, and Nguyen had listened with the focused patience of a man who took all information seriously and had said he would pass it up to the company commander. She did not know whether he had. She had slept in her kit for 3 nights running. On the Monday night before the attack, Rex had been restless in a way that was not his normal restlessness. He moved in his run and sat and moved again and kept looking east. Sarah had done an informal perimeter sweep at 2300 hours and found nothing, but the eastern ridgeline had looked different in the thermal scope in a way she couldn't quantify, which was the most dangerous kind of intuition, because it was hard to explain to anyone with authority. She had told Ochoa the next morning. Ochoa had written it up. The commander had thanked her and put an additional guard on the north tower, which was the wrong tower. Sarah had known then that the night was going to be bad. She'd gone back to the kennel checked Rex, felt the coin heavy in her cargo pocket, and made herself sleep. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Rex went silent. The eastern gate of COP Harrow was not a gate in any elaborate sense. It was a break in the HESCO barrier line, secured by a steel vehicle barrier and a single guard post that was nominally covered by the northeast tower. The breach had been made with a device against the HESCO wall itself, a section of barrier that had been structurally compromised by weather and a minor vehicle impact 2 months prior that had been reported but not yet repaired. Someone had known that. Someone with eyes on the compound and time to observe it had known exactly where the wall would fail. Sarah understood this in the first 30 seconds after the generator went down. She understood it because she had been thinking about it for 48 hours. The North Face rockets were the diversion. The eastern breach was the objective. The objective was not the motor pool, not the command post, not any structure. The objective was the soldiers inside those structures, disoriented in the dark, and 6 men moving fast through a breach they had pre-planned. She moved. Rex was in his patrol harness. She had put it on him while the second rocket was still echoing, because she had expected this. The harness had a small, red-lensed light on the handle that she activated now, giving her 3 feet of visible movement in the darkness. Rex was pulling forward. He could smell the fighters before she could see them. She let him work. The first contact came 47 meters inside the compound perimeter, near the shadow of the generator housing. 2 fighters moving along the wall, using the darkness and the noise of the burning motor pool as cover. Rex hit the first one before Sarah had the angle on the second. She had the M4A1 up, and she acquired the target through the ACOG, and she fired twice, and the second fighter went down, and she was already moving left to cover Rex, who had the first fighter on the ground and was communicating in his specific, wordless language the fact that the situation was handled. She told Rex off. He came. She processed the next 22 seconds in the compressed way that extreme stress does to experienced minds. Not slow motion, but clarified, with exceptional resolution. She identified Corporal Whitfield at her left shoulder. She identified Specialist Ochoa coming around the corner of the medical building at a run. She identified 3 additional muzzle flashes near the command post, which meant fighters who had gotten deeper into the compound than the initial breach point suggested, which meant a second entry she hadn't accounted for. She went toward the muzzle flashes. This was not the decision of a dog handler. This was not anything that a dog handler was supposed to do, and part of her knew that, and processed it, and set it aside, because the alternative was not setting it aside, and the alternative was 74 soldiers in a darkened compound against fighters who knew the layout and had initiative. She told Whitfield to stay on the eastern wall and call out any additional movement from the breach point. She told Ochoa to get to a covered position with a sight line on the command post entrance and hold it. She told both of them by speaking directly and keeping her voice flat. The way voices stay flat when the speaking part of the brain is working normally, but the rest of it is somewhere else, entirely. Then she told Rex to seek. Rex was 62 pounds of Belgian Malinois with 4 years of patrol training and a personality that could be described as optimistically aggressive. He moved through the compound with a speed and certainty that no human could replicate in its darkness. and he found the third fighter in the space between the communications building and the medical building, a pocket of shadow that Sarah wouldn't have covered for another 45 seconds. The engagement there was close. The fighter had an AK-74 and was reloading. She had the M4, A1 and 14 rounds left in the current magazine. She fired from 9 meters. She did not miss. Rex was already on the next vector. The fourth fighter was in the command post building. She knew this before she reached the door because Rex stopped and looked at the door with the specific attention he used for occupied structures. She stacked on the doorframe the way that doors are supposed to be entered, and the part of her that had done this before was calm, with a calmness that was not peace, but something colder and more functional. She made entry. The command post had 2 people in it who were not supposed to be there. One was the fighter. One was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Daly, the battalion commander, who had been there for a rare forward visit and had taken cover behind the communications console when the rockets hit. Daly was down behind the console with her M9 drawn and had not been seen by the fighter, who was looking for something, searching the space with his weapon, moving across the room in sweeps. Sarah shot him once from the doorway. He went down. She swept the room. No additional threats. She told the colonel to stay low and called out in a clear voice that the room was cleared, green, and then she moved back into the compound because Rex was telling her there were still things to find. The 5th and 6th fighters were together near the motor pool, which was fully involved now, the flames giving the entire north quadrant of the compound an orange quality that made everything look overexposed and unreal. The fire had spread to a fuel storage cage, and the heat at 30 meters was significant. She felt it on the left side of her face, a wall of warmth that made her squint. She took a fragment from the 6th fighter's weapon when it discharged during the engagement. The fragment hit her in the right forearm, above the wrist, a piece of steel that was less than a centimeter long, but felt like someone had drawn a line of fire from her wrist to her elbow. She registered it. She didn't stop. She sent Rex to assist with the 6th fighter, and she covered the space, and it was done, and the compound was quiet except for the fire and the sounds of soldiers beginning to move with purpose rather than panic. She was sitting on a HESCO barrier 6 minutes later, holding her right forearm with her left hand, when Ochoa found her. Ochoa had a flashlight, and she shone it on Sarah's arm and looked at the wound, and then looked at Sarah's face. And there was a long moment when neither of them said anything. The fire was still going. Someone had established radio contact, and she could hear the voice of the radio operator reporting up to higher in the flat tones of someone delivering information they needed to deliver before their hands started shaking. She had the bronze coin in her left hand. She had taken it out at some point during the 6 minutes of sitting. It was warm the way it was always warm, the weight of it familiar in a way that made the compound and the burning and the blood on her sleeve feel briefly grounded, tethered to a larger continuity of time. She put it back in her pocket. The battalion aid station was set up in the medical building, which had not taken any damage. She walked herself there and let the PA, a young man named Sergeant Alexander Price, remove the fragment from her forearm with local anesthesia and 5 stitches and a bandage that covered too much, and she told him so, and he ignored her. Rex sat at her feet through the entire procedure, pressed against her boots with his chin on her knee. watching Price with the evaluative calm of an animal that has decided not to commit to any particular response yet. Lieutenant Colonel Daly came to the aid station at 04:15 hours. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Sarah, who was checking the bandage with a dissatisfied expression, and then came inside and sat down on the cot opposite her. Rex looked up at Daly and then looked back at Sarah, which was his way of asking for guidance, and Sarah told him easy, and he put his chin back down. Daly asked her name, her full name. Sarah gave it. Daly asked her MOS, her prior service, specifically whether she had received any training beyond the dog handler course. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Sarah looked at the bandage on her arm and then looked at the colonel and told her the short version. Military police. Handler school. 4 deployments. A brief statement about Ranger school, delivered as flatly as if she were reading it from a form. Nothing about Nangarhar. Nothing about Djibouti. Just the shape of the record without the content. The way a house looks from the outside without telling you what's inside it. Daly was quiet for a moment. Then she asked about the tactical decisions, the Eastern Gate assessment, the breach point, the way Sarah had moved through the compound. Sarah told her that the breach point had been predictable from the intelligence pattern and the physical vulnerability of that wall section, and that someone should have gotten that wall repaired 2 months ago, and that the movements through the compound had been standard small unit clearing technique, nothing more. Daly looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Rex. Then she looked back at Sarah and said that she had been in the command post, and that if Sarah had taken 30 seconds longer, the outcome would have been different, and that she was aware of that and intended to remain aware of it. Sarah nodded. Ochoa came in a few minutes later, after Daly left, and sat down where the colonel had been sitting and looked at Sarah with an expression that was complicated and that Sarah recognized because she had seen it before on the faces of people who had made assumptions and then had to revise them. Ochoa said that she had a lot of questions. Sarah said she had a couple of answers. Ochoa asked about Ranger School first, because she had been thinking about the way Sarah moved since the first week, and now the thought had a shape. Sarah told her, all 3 phases, Class 09-14, no recycles. Ochoa sat with that for a moment. Then she asked why Sarah had never mentioned it. Sarah said that she found people treated her differently when they knew, and she preferred to be treated correctly. She preferred to be assessed on what she was actually doing, rather than on a credential that had nothing to do with running patrol routes with a dog in Kunar Province. Ochoa thought about this, and then said that she understood it, and didn't fully agree with it, but understood it. Rex got up and walked to the door of the medical building, and looked outside, and came back and lay down again. Sarah told Ochoa that 6 people were dead, and 1 soldier was wounded, and the compound was still standing, and that those were the facts that mattered, and that everything else could wait until after the battle damage assessment was complete. Ochoa said that she thought Sarah had said a couple of answers. Sarah conceded this. She allowed herself a small thing, not quite a smile, in the direction of the wall. The fragment wound healed in 11 days. She wore the bandage until Price said she didn't need it anymore, and she was back on full patrol rotation within 2 weeks, because there was no reason not to be, and because Rex needed the work. He became restless when they weren't running routes. She understood this about him completely. The battalion filed a report that included Sarah's actions that night, categorized under supporting contractor personnel, with a specific notation about tactical contribution. She had been told about the notation and had not requested it, and did not actively object to it, because the record would say what the record said, regardless of her feelings about it. What changed, more quietly and more durably, was the texture of the compound. The soldiers at COP Harrow began to treat her differently, not in a dramatic way, but in the way of people who have updated their understanding of someone and are now operating on the new information. Nguyen passed her in the motor pool 3 days after the attack, and stopped and looked at her in a way that acknowledged something, and she returned the look in a way that received the acknowledgement and closed the topic at the same time. Whitfield, who was 22 and from a town in Louisiana and had never been under fire before that night, came to the kennel annex the week after and asked if he could watch her run Rex on a training pattern. She said yes. He came twice a week after that, quiet and attentive, and she found herself explaining the dog's reading of a space, the way Rex used wind and movement, and the quality of silence to make decisions. And she noticed at some point that she was describing a philosophy as much as a training methodology. Ochoa continued to bring her intelligence products that she wasn't officially entitled to, and she continued to read them and return assessments that were never attributed to her and were never less than accurate. She left COP Harrow in February of the following year when her contract concluded. She flew out on a CH-47 Chinook at 0600 on a morning when the ridgeline was covered in cloud down to about 1,800 meters, and the valley below looked clean and small and temporary in the way that valleys always looked from the air, as though the mountains were the real thing and the valley was just the space between them. She went back to Fayetteville. The apartment had new tenants. She found a different place, a house this time, a rental on a street with actual trees. And she unpacked the second box. The bronze coin went on the windowsill in the kitchen, not in her pocket, not put away. On the sill, where the morning light came through and caught it. She had been carrying it for years as a weight and a reminder and a private conversation with a version of herself that existed on a specific Friday in Florida, standing at attention while an old man pressed metal into her palm and said something she had never repeated. She thought it was time for it to sit still for a while. Rex was there. She had retired him from service 2 months before her contract ended, navigating the paperwork with the focused determination of someone who had decided on an outcome and was going to obtain it. And he was in the yard now, on a Tuesday in April, moving along the fence line with his specific professional attention, checking things that probably didn't need checking, because some habits go all the way down. She watched him from the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Here is what Sarah Kowalski's story teaches us, if we're paying attention. It is not about proving doubters wrong. There were doubters at COP Harrow, the mild kind, the kind made of assumption rather than hostility, and they revised their assumptions when the facts required it, and that revision took perhaps 40 seconds on the night it happened, and then the world moved forward. That is not the story. The story is about the space between credentials and action. The Ranger tab existed. The deployments existed. The decisions made in a burning compound in Kunar Province existed. And all of those things existed in the same person who had been walking routes with a dog for 4 months, and had been called handler, and had been underestimated gently and consistently by people who thought they were treating her normally. The credential didn't create the capacity. The training created the capacity. The credential was just the notation in the margin. What the specific Tuesday night at COP Harrow illustrates is a thing that is difficult to articulate about military service, which is that the work people do quietly, without attribution, in the weeks and months before a crisis, is sometimes the most consequential work they will ever do. Sarah read the intelligence pattern. She said what she read. She slept in her kit for 3 nights. She had Rex in his harness before the second rocket hit. None of that was visible. None of it was documented. All of it mattered completely. There is also something worth sitting with about Rex. An animal that could not be briefed, could not be explained to, could not be decorated or promoted or retired with ceremony. And yet who moved through that compound with a clarity and purpose that exceeded every human being present. Sarah had spent years learning to listen to something that did not speak. That practice had taught her something about information that arrives without language, about knowledge that exists in the body before the mind can name it. She had gone quiet herself, in the same way. Not silent, quiet in a different sense, functional. The kind of quiet that listens more than it speaks, that withholds not out of fear, but out of understanding. She had learned that from the dogs. She had learned it from the long deployments. She had learned it from the sergeant major who gave her the coin on a Friday in Florida and said the quiet thing she never repeated, which was the kind of thing you hold rather than share, because sharing would reduce it, and holding it keeps it whole. The coin is on the windowsill now. The morning light comes through and finds it. Before you go, if this story landed with you in any way, take a second to hit like. It helps more than you might expect. Here is a question worth leaving in the comments. There is a specific kind of person who carries their credentials quietly, who lets their actions speak without biography attached. Have you worked with someone like that, in the military or outside of it? And what was it like when you finally found out who they actually were? The comments are worth reading when people answer that one honestly. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss them. They go up regularly. Sarah Kowalski would probably not watch this video. She would be outside with Rex, walking the fence line, checking things that probably didn't need checking, because some habits go all the way down, and some people are just built to be ready for whatever Tuesday brings next.